Hi, my name's James. I paint miniatures. This is Spoon 37 Minis. Right, so this is What's on the Bench, episode 4. We're continuing with the Goliaths. Here I've got a Goliath that's been primed, as you've seen in the early videos. Now I'm going to apply the first colour to it. What I'm doing here is called dry brushing. It's one of the earliest techniques that you'll learn as a painter. All you do is get some paint on the brush, wipe the brush on the tissue as you see, and then rub the brush back and forth over the surfaces. I'm majoring on the surfaces which I think are supposed to be metal afterwards, of course, but the nature of this technique is you kind of have to do it first, because if you don't, what you'll get is a lot of overspill on parts that you've already painted. So I usually do this as the very first step. Whatever colour I'm planning to dry brush gets done first, even if this means later on when I do other colours it might actually not be possible to dry brush. Now the idea of this technique is that having wiped most of the paint off the brush, it only actually picks out the raised surfaces, so all of the peaks get covered in the paint, which in this case is Games Workshop Leadbelcher, and then that picks out all of the raised details, leaving all of the recesses dark, which is one of the reasons why you start off with such a dark black primer, so that you get this nice sort of effect from just this simplistic coat where you just rub the brush back and forth, and before you know it you've picked out all of the details, and it looks surprisingly good for very little effort. This is why it's one of the most recommended techniques for beginners, and you can get quite far just using dry brushing all by itself, but obviously with the aforementioned problem of the kind of overspill, what you find is after you've done some dry brushing and you start to paint some of the smaller parts of the model, some of the more detailed areas, you're going to want to learn different techniques so you can still highlight them without having this kind of overspill problem. Now, as you can see, this really doesn't take very long. He's pretty much done, and as this has made actually a much shorter clip than I wanted, I'm actually going to show you doing another model, this time the gang leader with his hammer slung over his shoulder. There's a bit more metal on this one, so it's perhaps a better demonstration of the techniques. I'm starting with the top of the hammer and just doing all the metallic bits around there, whereas normally on most of the gang members I start on all of the sort of metallic stuff strapped to their backs to help them with all the heavy lifting, because these are kind of rebelling industrial workers, so they got a lot of sort of power lifting stuff to help them do their industrial tasks. But then of course this means they're very much stronger than all the other gangs when it comes to combat, because of course they're not only jacked but they've got all these industrial looking things all over them as well. So that means there's a lot of metal to dry brush. So same technique again, just going through dry brushing anything that looks like it's made of metal. I've got to be honest here, I'm not sure what the gun is supposed to look like when it's finished, so I'm hedging my bets by dry brushing the whole thing, and then I can kind of see myself whether I paint over it later or not, and anything that needs to remain metal like the gun barrels can just stay pretty much as it is. Now you may notice as I go through, I'm taking particular care to hit things like the belt and the mask and so on, and the sort of knee pads and elbow pads and so on, but I'm almost completely skipping the base. And you might be thinking like, oh, that'd be really easy, just use the same technique on the base and you're done. The only problem is I'm trying to copy the box art, and the box art makes it look like they've painted the base brown and then dry brushed it grey and then painted in some other details by hand, and I'm going to try and replicate that if I can. Now the next step from this is to, at least in my opinion, paint the flesh colour. Now, as you can see in the background, I've already done some of the models in different flesh colours. One's had kit sleeve flesh, the others had oak brown from the army painter for different skin tones. This is kind of the standard skin colour that they recommend you paint. What I can't understand, however, is the official Warhammer TV video on how to paint Goliaths has you paint every part of the model apart from the skin first, and then asks you to base coat Bugmans Glow last, which means you've got to be excessively careful not to get paint on all those other details. Now, up to a point I'm having to be careful. You'll see I'm using a Games Workshop S layer brush, which has a very fine point, which is particularly helpful around the face, and it's also helpful for getting in between all the various straps and industrial machinery all over the sort of upper body and so on, but at the same time I'm not too worried about getting paint on other parts, because most of those other parts aren't painted yet. So like the straps on his shoulders, I'm going to paint in later, so if I get them covered in Bugmans Glow, there's no problem. I don't honestly know why the Warhammer TV video is like that, suggesting that you paint to a surprisingly high standard all of the pieces of the model apart from the skin, and then the skin, being one of the hardest to get to areas, gets painted last. So I'm doing it a different way. I'm painting the skin first. So this is dead simple. It's just Bugmans Glow. I'm painting nice and carefully all over, well, mostly the face at this point, but it will be all of the skin areas that get coated with Bugmans Glow. Just having a bit of trouble with the face. The area around the cigar and the mouth and so on this one is particularly tricky, particularly as I'll basically want to stick the brush where his arm is. This would have been a good candidate for sub-assemblies had I thought about it. But it's just kind of awkward to get to, so I'm painting his face and I'm leaving this kind of dark area around his mouth. I will get to it eventually, but it's just a little more awkward than I'd ideally like it to be. Now, I am, despite having talked about not getting too much overspill and not overpainting too much, I am still being fairly careful. It is my painting style. I do say that I'm a slow painter. This is one of the main reasons. So these clips are a little bit longer and they do take a bit more time to get through all of the various details with this colour. Now, I do paint all of these Goliaths in roughly the same order, so I always do the face and then the areas around the neck and the tops of the shoulders, and then I'll start with the back and the arms and so on, and I'll finish up with the hands. And this, just doing these in the same order each time, it just makes sure that I don't miss anything. That having been said, on one of them, the guy, I think he's called Splitter Krog, who has the two-handed axe, I realised after putting pictures on Instagram saying, oh, this one's done, that I'd actually completely forgotten to paint his hands. So I can still make mistakes, I frequently do, and it's one of the things I'm hoping to do with this channel is show you that not only do I make mistakes, but also here's how you can fix them. Hopefully not too many mistakes on this clip, so hopefully there won't be much to fix, but if I do make mistakes, I'll show you how to tidy them up afterwards. It's mostly just overpainting with the appropriate colour. Now, I may seem to be taking my time over this area around the sort of collarbone area, but there are a lot of little nooks and crannies and details around there, and it can be quite difficult to get the paint in the right places. There's also metal pieces that I dry brushed earlier that I'm trying not to get paint on. But now I'm moving on to the slightly easier parts, so like the arm, part of the back here. And then you'll find that although I do have to kind of move around some of the belts and the bracers and the little wire on his arm and so on, it's actually a little bit easier to get to these sections, so you can paint them much more quickly. due to all these fine details, you can, particularly if you're a beginner, you can feel like you need a smaller brush and a smaller brush and a smaller brush. And actually, although I'm using a brush with a fairly fine tip here, actually the more used to it you get, the more you find you can use a brush that takes a bit more paint and actually still squeeze it into the nooks and crannies. And you also worry less about overpainting, because like I said before, if I do overpaint an area, even an area that I've got Leadbelcher on at the moment, for example, if I overpaint that, it's very easy to go back in and paint over it properly. So you get used to this kind of back and forth process, and that makes you a lot more relaxed about if you do get paint on, you know, some of the armour or belt or something. It doesn't really matter. I do try to be neat and tidy though, so that it's mainly in the right areas. I mean, that's how I started off painting with my very first miniature, and it seems to work well, so I'm going to stick with it. Now, one of the problems with these Goliaths is, as I said before, they are jacked, so they've got all of the lumps and bumps and so on of all the muscles you would expect on a pro bodybuilder. So that's great. Unfortunately, it's not so easy for getting a brush and paint into the area under his arm. In particular, has a lot of recesses that I personally wasn't expecting, and just trying to get the paint into those fine details can be quite problematic. But you get through it. Like I say, if you've got enough paint on the brush, it's nice and thin, watered down, and you just use a fine brush and a steady hand, you should be able to get in all of the details. And of course, once you've got them covered, I'll do a second coat of Bugmans Glow, obviously, and then use a flesh wash, which will then run into all of those recesses. So it is very important that you get all of the parts of the model covered that you intend to be skin coloured afterwards. Again, it is these kind of areas, sort of under the arm, leading up to the belts. There's also a tiny area right at the front of the model where there's the armour plate above, there's two little belts hanging down, and then there's this tiny strip in the middle that you need to get paint into, which can be extremely awkward. But again, if you aren't too worried about a little bit of overpainting, it's quite easy to get paint in there. I would recommend getting at least the base colour of paint in there, because if that's all you do, it still looks like the right colour when you're finished, and it's such a small area that you can kind of get away with not having it fully, you know, shaded and highlighted. Obviously you would if you were, you know, doing this for a, you know, a contest or something, but I mean, I'm just trying to have something that looks good on the tabletop. It doesn't, you know, as long as I'm happy with it, that's all that really matters, you know. But it's your hobby, you can paint to as high or low a standard as you please. Obviously the high standard requires more skill and more practice, but all it really takes is, you know, time and practice and application of the skills you develop. Obviously there are 10 gang members. I've actually done 3 of them with alternative skin colours, which I didn't record because, in all honesty, I haven't used the colours as base coats that I used for those before, and I genuinely wasn't sure how they'd look using the colours that I thought maybe sort of would work. So I videoed the Bugmans Glow because I know that will look okay with just one coat. Obviously I'll do 2 for proper coverage, and sure enough, once this was dry, it was obvious that it did actually need better coverage in some places. There were areas, particularly on the back, that looked like there were little bits of black showing through, so it quite obviously needed a bit more doing. But it still looks quite good for one coat, whereas, for example, the guy on the left in the background has had 3 coats of kit sleeve flesh from the Games Workshop, which is a layer paint, which is why it's much more transparent. and the guy that's currently obscured has a much darker skin tone using Army Paint Oak Brown, which is also 3 layers of paint, but just to get the same kind of coverage that I'm getting here with 1 coat of Bugmans Glow. So as I say, I didn't take a video of those simply because it wouldn't have looked as good and I wasn't as sure of myself. Now obviously at this point, if you wanted to, you could just block in the base colours for every single colour that you're going to paint. You could be painting the trousers and the armour plates and the belts and the handle of the hammer and all that sort of stuff, the black on the boots and everything. I don't typically paint that way. I typically paint a colour and I will use washes or shades to pick out the recesses, and then I will use sort of layer paints or just ordinary paints in a lighter colour to highlight the various details all the way, and then I will move on to the next colour. And of course what you then have is this kind of diminishing thing where you're doing smaller and smaller details as you go along, but you're fully highlighting each piece. And so it actually starts off really slow, because obviously I've got to do this skin colour, which you're seeing over several minutes of footage. I've got to do that on 7 models, having already done 3 of them. This is the first of those 7. So it'll take me quite a long time to do this, whereas when I do the first highlight layer, the areas I paint will be much smaller, and then when I do the next highlight layer, they're even smaller still, and it gets a little quicker and a little quicker and a little quicker. And you do that with all the details all over the model, or at least that's how I've been painting since I came back into the hobby, and I've found it very rewarding. Alright, we are getting towards the end of this model, nearly done with the hands, and then I'll just give it a quick once over, make sure every part of it is painted. I won't bore you by showing you the next 6 models that are exactly the same. So this is pretty much going to be the end of episode 4 of What's on the Bench. Right, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, hit like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell-shaped icon so you get notifications about when the next video will be out. I hope that will be soon. Thank you for watching.